What's interesting is that the ethical banks don't generally pay the highest rate of interest on something like a cash ISA. I remember a year or so ago I was doing some interviews for radio about ethical savings, and I looked then at the difference between the ethical cash ISAs and the non-ethical cash ISAs. And at the time, you could get about 2.5% on an ethical cash ISA and about 3-ish on a non-ethical one. And I sort of worked out the difference in interest that you would get if you tipped your entire cash ISA allowance into an ethical cash ISA on day one versus if you didn't. And I did that again. I was scooting around a few websites a couple of days ago. And basically at the moment, you'd miss out on about £42 interest a year, or kind of £4 a month. And for some people, £4 a month will make a huge difference. But for a lot of people, it's not actually that big a deal. And yet, people are making this choice of not shopping around on the basis necessarily of getting the best rate, when the whole way that we as consumers as a whole is shopping is about price. It's about people using vouchers to go to a pizza restaurant. It's about people comparing prices. It's about people getting cash back. And there's sort of this whole movement of getting everything as cheaply as possible. And yet people are making a choice in some areas of their money, certainly when it comes to ethical savings. And I think that's really interesting and really encouraging. And when you start talking to people about what's available and what the banks and building societies are trying to do that's a bit different, there still seems to be it's still news to them. I mean, I was telling somebody about Triodos Bank and the fact that you can go onto a website and you can see every single loan they make. With Charity Bank, you can see the kind of social projects that benefit from their loans. And this is just, I mean, it's such a strange idea when you think about how our banks operate at the moment. And for most of us who have current accounts, with one of the high street banks, not necessarily an ethical provider, I mean, we don't have any idea what they're doing with our money. So I think that's really encouraging. But when you look at what people do with longer term money, when it comes to investments, that galvanisation of interest and action around ethical savings isn't necessarily translating in the same way around ethical finance. And again, I was scooting around the internet a couple of days ago, just getting some sort of headlines to see what kind of coverage there was about ethical investing. And I kind of thought, I know what some of these headlines will be because they crop up every year around this time. Can you profit from your principals? Should this fund have a certain stock in it? And it was sort of with quite a sort of heavy heart that I read the headlines in the mainstream press. And I do think that one of the real problems for people who want to get started in ethical investing is it's very hard to get information that sort of doesn't have an agenda, that is pitched at the level that doesn't assume that you know what all the terms mean. So, I mean, if you look on comparison sites, they very rarely mention ethical investing. One of the biggest comparison sites has, I think, 4 ethical funds at the moment that doesn't really go into detail about what it is they offer. If you look on other sort of websites that the mainstream press don't have a huge amount, there are some really good specialist sites, such as yourethicalmoney.org from Iris is very good. UCSIF, and obviously for National Ethical Investment Week, there's a lot of information there. But I think it's very hard for people to actually take that first step. And I think one of the other issues is that if you read the coverage in the mainstream personal finance press, then I think you'll be put off because you think, oh, it just seems so flawed, what's the point? But I mean, I really agree with what Lee was saying just a moment ago, which is if you don't do anything different with your money, then you are kind of part of the problem. And I think that although, if you look at the funds that are available, I think there's now around 100 different ethical, in the broadest sense, investment funds. And that ranges from what was traditionally seen as ethical, so that would normally be the kind of funds that would screen out companies that did the nasty, such as, manufacturing arms, or being involved in areas where there was an oppressive regime, or gambling or tobacco, whatever was on your list. These days, of course, it's much, the movement has evolved, as have the funds, so you can get those that brand themselves as sustainable or socially responsible. The real big theme over the last few years has been some green or environmental or clean energy or climate funds. There's also funds that engage, so they may or may not screen out companies that they invest in, but they will try to bring about a difference by talking to the companies that they invest in and making them do business in a different way. The problem with engagement in a way is that they can only talk to companies if there's a business case for them making change. So, you know, if a fund was, for example, investing in tobacco, they're not going to be able to engage with them about not selling tobacco, but they might be able to engage with them about not selling tobacco to teenagers in Africa. But I think sometimes there can be a real problem around what a fund may deliver. Often, as well, the engagement process is behind the scenes, and it takes a long time, and it can be hard to know whether there's any, it's like one of those, you know, swans on the surface or a duck or whatever it is, that there's nothing happening on the surface, but there's frantic paddling underneath. And sometimes that brings about results, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think as an outsider, or as somebody who's not an expert, it can be difficult to know whether the fund is doing something and trying really hard and banging on the door and having meetings every fortnight, or whether actually they're just sitting there and thinking, we've got good branding. I think one of the things that's good to think about if you're starting to consider the idea of investing ethically is to actually look at what's important to you. And I think, you know, if you're going to invest ethically, it is going to involve compromise, because the big mainstream funds, it's very difficult to get one that will be completely aligned with your own ideas. You can work out what's important to you, and I kind of think, you know, compromise in some ways is no bad thing. We do it every day in every aspect of our lives. You know, the kind of recycling glass, but then driving when we don't need to, and taking flights even though we don't like the idea of climate change. So the kind of things that I think is a good idea to think about are, you know, where you want to draw the line. So if there are things that you don't want your money to be invested in, do you want to make sure that you have a fund that doesn't invest in those companies at all? Or are you okay if it's a very small percentage of turnover, or if a company sells whatever the product is that you don't like in a responsible way? So just to give you some examples, if you don't like the idea of investing in a fund that buys shares in a company that has anything to do with weaponry or armaments, does it make a difference to you how the products are sold? You know, are you okay if they're sold in the UK to defend, so the UK can defend itself against terrorists? Is it okay if it's sold in a country that is itself under attack from aggressors? Or do you just draw the line if it's being sold to a country that's going to, you know, use it in an exploitative way and use it to suppress its own population? If you do want to avoid a company that's investing in arms, you know, do you want to avoid the ones that make the machine guns? Do you want to avoid the ones that make the screws that hold the machine guns on? Do you want to avoid the ones that make the headphones that are used in the broadcast industry, but that soldiers also use, you know, to listen to what's going on? What about house building companies? Are you happy to invest in house building companies? That's good, we need housing. What happens if it also makes army barracks? Would that bother you? What about a cereal manufacturer if it had a contract with the army? Would that bother you? It is very complex. I mean, I hesitate to say that it involves 50 shades of grey, but it's certainly not black and white. But these are questions that you have to ask and think about yourself before you can take that step.